And now to the final speaker, and a heartfelt thanks, particularly because of Giulia. I think it's 6:30 a.m. in the morning in the UK. Is that right? So you must be exhausted. So it's an absolute pleasure and privilege for you to join us, especially because you're at Warwick, where I was taught too. It's a great university, so I'm really looking forward to your talk. Giulia's going to talk. Her paper's called "Of Loss, Plague, and Capitalism: Gothic Sci-Fi and Apocalyptic Scenarios in Lockdown." Welcome, Giulia. Come on.
So I'm just going to try and share my screen to show my PowerPoint. I don't know if it's working. Share. Oh, okay. All right, so let me see if it works now. So I'm not going to share a screen where you can see all of your faces. It's always a bit awkward. Where did my PowerPoint go? There we go. PowerPoint presentation. Is this working? Can you see it?
Yeah, well done.
Lovely. Been doing this for over a year, teaching online, and you would expect I can do it. Can you see the? I'm gonna swap to full screen. Is that working? Yeah. Used to use Teams at work, so I'm getting used to Zoom now. All right, so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Rachel, for the invitation, but thank you especially to Kate and Michelle for just amazing talks. There's so much going on in my mind right now. I hope I'll be able to focus to what I wanted to talk about. And obviously, I apologize a little bit if I'm slightly in Korean. I'm not usually a morning person, so it's a personal challenge, which I think is good. I need to get up earlier usually. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. I'm very excited about the conversation that will follow as well. So I have a slightly less read paper in a way, or structured paper that was trying to put together different ideas. And that when I started with this title, I wanted to focus in particular as well on ways in which the reason so I had capitalism in there was the ways in which some, the entertainment marketplace can capitalize on certain apocalypse and the issues that might create. So I'll briefly touch on to that. But I think the bulk and the conclusion of my paper will focus in particular as well on ideas of hauntings that are attached to sort of the idea of the post-apocalyptic scenario, or something such as the apocalyptic scenario in the context of post-colonial studies. So there'll be a bit of two tangents that I'm hoping to sort of bring together. We'll see if it works. So this image here serves to illustrate the next slide, which is a very long quote, and it's not very nice to have long quotes, but I won't read through it all. I just wanted to put it there in case people were interested. But in my title, the idea of Gothic sci-fi is taken from Sean MacArthur's book, who looks at Gothic science fiction and considers the way these two genres comes together. And we've talked a lot about genre, and I'm very interested to see how we can sort of make all these fantastic genre very malleable and look at nomenclature in a different way. And what I found very interesting in her book is the way through which she looks at different, typically Gothic sort of novels or work, and how certain scenarios sort of supplemented with some sort of science fiction idea. And she looks at different genre. But what I was interested in particular is this idea of the last man on earth as a very typical apocalyptic scenario that, according to her, is very Gothic in itself, in particular because it is focused like the Gothic, according to her, because I'm not an expert on the Gothic. So I think some of you might be more, and you can tell me the way in which the Gothic sort of is focused on the idea of the male hair and lineage, ancestral lineage, and the way Last Man on Earth expands this sort of trope to be something that all of humanity must focus on, because you want to avoid being, the last man on Earth, and you want humanity to come back in a way. So there's these ideas that she's looking at. And so not to have a massive quote the whole time, this idea of isolation in the apocalypse, in a way, which I think comes back to some of the ideas we're talking about when we talk about isolation in lockdown. So knowing that people are out there, but not being able to connect in the same way. And I think this idea of capitalization of the marketplace, I wanted to bring it around with consideration of COVID sort of 19 movies or TV that has been sort of slowly spreading, some as early as 2020 already. And I'm going to put an example now that I do not recommend you watch. It's not a good movie, but I think it works really well with these ideas of the apocalyptic scenario being used as something for COVID. So the movie's Songbird came out in December 2020. It's really bad. But what I found interesting is in a lot of these 2020 COVID movie or 2021 COVID series, I think there's a whole TV show as well that's supposed to be based on Zoom. But a lot of journals or newspaper review were talking about how it's too early, right? Or it's too soon kind of response to the COVID. And what I found fascinating is really very much this fact that this is a topic we can talk about. It's a pandemic. Everybody likes to talk about the apocalypse. We're living through one. Let's make a movie out of it. Notwithstanding the reality of loss that is very present and the real suffering that people went through. And so here, I want to focus in particular on this idea that apocalyptic scenarios can be problematic because they are attractive in many ways. They are seductive. And before COVID, I think in particular, there was a certain attraction to it in entertainment, obviously, but they also became rhetorically problematic tropes because when there is an excitement about a possible zombie apocalypse, it becomes a less effective trope to catalyze change and discuss issues such as, for example, the environmental crisis, right? So there's this idea that catastrophism is trivialized in a way, and specifically in the entertainment marketplace. And that doesn't allow then talking about real catastrophe that will happen. And I think talking to people who are mostly based in Australia, with the year that happened before COVID, between fire and ice across the continent and then COVID, it feels like, catastrophism is not something that is attractive at all, right? So there's been, over the last few years, this use of the trope of something that sort of is attractive. And I think it's very specific also to a US-based kind of community of, preppers are a very special thing in the US, and there's a whole market of that. And if you're not sure what preppers are, I can explain a bit more in the question, but it's roughly just people who prepare for the apocalypse by buying bunkers, are extremely sophisticated bunkers and weaponry and etc. So, and I think there are examples of that all over the world, probably. So I'm bringing here towards sort of the second part and end of my talk and the conclusion by looking at this idea of now that we've lived through a form of what can be an apocalyptic scenario in many ways, does that allow us also to empathize more with some marginalized communities who, and this is not really my original argument, have been living through apocalypses for a long time. And I think in the case, especially also of Australia, there's a lot of Indigenous authors who engage with that. I don't work in particular on them, so I can't really talk to that, but I think, okay, no, that's great. I had a block in my brain, sorry. Still waking up. But the authors I've been looking at are more Latin American, Caribbean based. And obviously in the case of the Caribbean, as different islands, there's different type of apocalypses that have been taking place there, but also through the Atlantic trade. And all the general trope of what can be seen as science fiction, but also horror and the Gothic often become real. They're not irrealism, as Michael Lowry sort of described irrealism, but rather are real life scenarios, right? The alien invasion is an extremely good trope to explain the, going into a new place to colonize it. Alien abduction works really well for the Atlantic trade. Viral pandemic that destroy people, explain, very well. Also the virality brought by different European sailors in the Caribbean, for example. So there is this idea that these tropes can tell a real story in many ways. And my question that I'm sort of putting there for the audience today and for the discussion is, because then we're going through these apocalypses in a more, and when I say we, I mean sort of the more, white or Western or more preserved people who have not really lived through these before in a way, even though I know there's a different space between me in Europe and you in Australia, obviously, but can this allow us rather to be something of capitalization and this tool of rhetoric that has become sort of moot because there was this excitement created by the entertainment marketplace, something that allows us to empathize more with post-colonial communities or some marginalized communities? Not that we can understand, obviously, but can some of the suffering we might have gone through allow us for that, and then create loss as a catalyst for empathy? And obviously, what is really important to note is that we've not lived through the same pandemic. We've not lived through the same apocalypse. There's clearly a continuation of the structural and systemic inequalities that already existed in the way the pandemic has lived. And though this could potentially, through the idea of loss as empathy, allow us to sort of, try to picture, understand, or depending what word you prefer to use, I think it's personal. We need to bear in mind that obviously there is something that just continues. The pandemic, though it could have allowed us to connect in some ways, has also exacerbated already existing inequalities. And, I'm not saying anything new here. So as I conclude here, I wanted to say a couple words to come back also to the really brilliant talk that Kate and Michelle had given. Really loved it. Loved them. They were fantastic. And looking at the idea of haunting in an apocalyptic scenario in particular, because it's not always something you might put together. Though when Sean was opening the round table, you were talking about this idea of the ruined city as haunting as well, which obviously is very crucial to the imagery we've been seeing, and is really, I think, interesting in this idea of haunting as something that comes back and haunts. And my point being here that if you read some apocalyptic scenario through post-colonial studies or indigenous studies, or look at specifically post-colonial authors or indigenous author writing, that kind of post-apocalyptic scenario or apocalyptic scenario, we have a hunting that is there. And there's different ones. There's the one of loss, of different communities being obliterated, but there's also the hunting, the continued colonial hunting that is still there and that continues to be there. And that's why this is such a useful trope, I think, in post-colonial studies, because it allows to illustrate something that is mad, really, right? In many ways, and to try, and I think here what Kate was talking about, this idea that horror could be a way to talk about grief, I think it works really well with this idea of colonial grief as well, and post-colonial grief. And so for hunting and this idea of the spectre, I usually base myself a lot on Derrida's idea of the spectre, this idea of the revenant, so from French revenant, and this idea of to come back and a continual comeback, which I think works very well if you also wrap it in Kamal Brathwaite, who looks at this idea of ghost as a type of, a past that will not leave, that continues to be, and that continues to be here, and in particular in the context of the Caribbean, it's a past that seeps in through the land and becomes the pasture. So obviously, there's a pun there that really attach it to the land, and that to me, is expressed really well in Christina Sharp's In the Wake, when she talks about this idea of a past that is not the past, because some structural inequalities continue to be here and continue to put certain communities at arms or in arm's way. So I haven't really focused on specific books or literature throughout this talk. I've put there two images of two that I've used before that I think are really great. One of them is Juno Diaz's short story Monstro, which I think is really well known. If you haven't read it yet, it's quite short and you can find it online for free on The New Yorker. And I think it plays a lot with these ideas. The author himself wrote an article called What the Apocalypse Reveals when he was thinking about a post-80 Haiti earthquake in 2011. But it continues to be extremely topical today, given that the country went through an earthquake very recently, again, a few months ago. And there's also this Equatoguinean author, Sezamba Mogo, hasn't been translated yet, but I hope it's going to be translated soon. It's a collection of short story and poems, and it includes a short story called The Dream of Dayo. That would be the translation, where thinking about the apocalypse is a way to think about the fate of some parts of the African continent, according to him. So I'm going to finish now by just thinking about this idea of hunting in the apocalypse and the idea of monster, and bringing it back together also with when we were talking about with the idea of the city in ruin. And the last few words I wanted to say is this idea that monstrousness, I think, plays also a crucial role here, because a lot of scholars are focused on how monster coming from Latin tells us something about, a sign from God or some sort of warning. But there's also something quite specific in the Latin words, which is so actually I might read that because it might sound better because it's so early in the morning and I don't have it here. But so from monster, from the Latin, come as monere, like everybody knows, but it also is akin to the word for monument, so which is created by the same sort of root and adding of the momentum, so sort of the entum, which is like the Latin, so not the prefix, the suffix that is collated to it. And so to me, there's this idea that monstrousness and monster can also be in many ways just monuments, or representing a monument of these colonial pasts that are, hunting these sort of post-colonial kind of apocalypse. So thank you, and sorry if I was a bit incoherent there. Let me stop the share.
You weren't incoherent at all. That was beautiful, powerful, and quite moving in all its ripples and architecture. So thank you very much.